Hey guys, it's Sam, and I recently realized that I hadn't done a wrap up in a minute. So I have like 15 books, but I'm splitting them into fiction and nonfiction because I've read a ton of nonfiction so far this year. I would say like half of what I've read. So about half of what I've read recently is nonfiction and the other half is fiction. And I just wanted to split it up in some way, and this made the most sense to me. So you're currently watching the fiction. I will get to the nonfiction in an upcoming video. So first, I reread For the Wolf by Hannah Witten. This is the first book in the Wilderwood duology. I listened to this on audio this time around, but I've also read the physical copy the first time I read it. This is an adult fantasy duology primarily following our main character of Red. She is the second of two sisters. When two daughters like this are born in royalty, one is for the throne, the firstborn, and one is for the wolf, the secondborn. So she essentially gets sacrificed to this like being that takes care of the woods. Like, you're not exactly sure who the wolf is and what that means. You know, obviously twist on Red Riding Hood. And she's actually kind of relieved to go because she's been having a nature magic start to unfold and she finds herself really dangerous. And so she's like, at least in the woods, I'll be fine. Even if I die or whatever, because mostly these women don't last very long. And so she ends up going. She discovers not only is the wolf like actually a man, and her powers can actually be helpful to this corrupted forest that is butting up against their kingdom. You also get different POV chapters from her sister, the firstborn, who is desperately trying to get Red back and is going to extreme lengths to do so, and her book is the second book in the duology. So I was rereading this just to remember everything. This continues to be a 5 stars for me. I think I've done a review for this years ago when I read it, so I'll link that on the screen if I have. But this has nature magic, that's corrupted woods. It has sort of like a Beauty and the Beast-y vibe to it with like him sort of taking her, whatever. Again, nature, woods, all of that. And yeah, I also find the sister storyline to be really interesting as well, so looking forward to getting to that to finish up this duology soon. That's one of my series goals for this year anyways, this duology. Then I read The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. This is a book that I've already done a full spoiler-free review on, so I'll link that on the screen. This is the first book in a silk punk fantasy series. There's 4 books in the series, I believe. And this one is primarily like a sort of reimagining of, I say it in the review and I'm just forgetting, I think it's the Ming Dynasty. All of the wars and the conflict and stuff leading up to this dynasty, but this is in more of a fantasy setting. So this first book, I talk about this more in my review, is very heavily military fantasy and not a lot of character focus, and so I was a little bit put off by that. I ended up giving it only about 3 stars. Like, the writing is good, but like, there is such distance from the characters. There's so many characters. It's really just about this, like, here's all this conflict and turmoil and all these things and all these players, and even these people that are major players only get like a chapter or 2, and it's just like a lot. It's a very big book. It's a lot. A lot of people on my review have already said that this is almost like a prologue for the whole series, like sets up everything for the whole series, and then the rest of the books are fantastic and have a lot of character work and whatever. I typically resent that in series when they do that. I don't love having to be like, you need to read the first book just to get to the next ones. Like, that's very annoying to me, but I've already read this one, so I will probably continue. A lot of people that I trust their recommendations really love this series. I do resent that this one is so heavy though, and so much. There are snippets. Again, the writing is good. I think the world is interesting. The little bit of character stuff that we do get is interesting. It's just like, I wish there was more, and I wanted this to be more character driven than it was. This just didn't quite have enough to hold me with. It's like mostly military strategy, and military fantasy and sci-fi and everything is not my thing. So 3 out of 5 stars for this first installment. Then I read Masquerade by Oo Sangoyemi. This was a book club pick for January, I believe. This was our book club pick for House Salt Book Club, so I will link that on the screen. We talk about 2 books that I talk about in this video there. But this is a story that's very, very, very loosely based on the Persephone myth, but set in a West African sort of fantasy world, where our main character of Adodo is abducted essentially from her home to live with this like kind of king who is this like conquering man trying to take over everything, and she is torn between being very naive but also very like wanting to be involved in the politics and stuff, not knowing if she should trust this man, not knowing who to trust, all of that. So yeah, very lightly based on the Persephone myth and sort of being abducted to the underworld and all of that and coming into her power. This unfortunately didn't quite hit for me. I found a lot of things to be kind of disjointed as far as her character work. It was, sometimes she was naive, but then she was also an expert battle strategist. And like, a lot of the pacing of how she got to where she got. The ending made a lot of sense, but it didn't quite feel like there was enough time for that evolution. There was a little bit of like a switch very quickly of like, it makes sense why we got there. Like, I kind of compare this to the end of Game of Thrones. I know we don't speak of it, but I'm speaking of it now. I'm very sorry. The way that Dany ended in Game of Thrones makes sense to me. She just got there way too quickly. Even with there being seeds planted, it was too fast of a move. So while it's like, I think that could be a reality for that character, the pacing at which it happened was too fast. That's kind of how this was. And this was mostly like a character-driven story. So there were things about Adodo that was just very naive and frustrating, and she's someone that you really want to shake. And just there was things about her like character arc and progression that just didn't like really hit for me. Like, it didn't quite make a lot of sense. So this one's like a 3 out of 5 stars. I would still read other things by this author. This was their debut. I would still read other things. There were parts about it that I liked a little bit. There was things that I just wish we had more time with. It almost felt like it could have been in duology, to be honest. And then we would have gotten more time for this like character evolution that I feel didn't quite make sense at the pace that it happened. Then I reread Belladonna by Adeline Grace. This is the first book in a upper YA fantasy series. I've already done a full review for this series as well, so I'll link that on the screen. But this is following our main character who, at infancy, essentially, her entire family was killed at this giant party. Everyone was poisoned, but she is immune to poison, and she's immune to death. And so death as a character, as an entity, is sort of attached to her and kind of follows her. And so this is sort of like a Death in the Maiden story. We're not really sure why she has this connection to death, but also can't die. And she ends up being passed around as a child to a bunch of different caretakers, and everyone ends up dying. And she's like, I hate you, death. And then ends up going to this extended family member's home, finds out that someone was recently murdered at that house, and that her cousin, who's around her age, is also in danger as well, possibly being poisoned. And so she is following this mystery, and everything goes from there. This whole series, like I said, I've already done a full review for, and I really enjoy. This is perfect gothic mystery with some romance. Perfect for me. Like, I loved everything about it. Very gothic aesthetic. This first book was a 5-star. There's like a slight love triangle, but in a way that makes a lot of sense. The mystery and stuff is really good. This was a reread, and I still had forgotten things about the twist, which makes it so good because I still was like, this is so well constructed that I like had forgotten what the whole mystery was and who done it and whatever. And I haven't even read this book originally that long ago. So yeah, really recommend this if you are very into that like poison gothic mystery. There's some little ghosts, but nothing super scary. It's not really horror. But yeah, loved this first one. I will talk about the rest of them throughout this video as well. I then read The Truth According to Ember by Danica Nava. This is also one that we did for book club. That was our February book club pick. And this is following the main character of Ember, who is a Native American woman and has like kind of been hard on her luck for a while. She wants to be an accountant, and she ends up lying about being an accountant in order to get a job at this like tech firm. And on her first day, right before the interview, she meets the love interest, who is also a Native man, and they like pretty immediately bond, but she has just this series of lies. Like, she just keeps lying about basically everything because she's told this one lie. She just feels like she keeps having to lie, and everything goes from there. So it becomes like sort of an office romance with the backbone of her just being a hot mess. So with that being said, I realized, having read this book, that I am confirmedly say I do not like office romances, number one. And number two, and I knew this before, but I just didn't know how messy she was going to be, I don't like, especially contemporary, messy main characters. In anybody. Like, I just, it's not even about her. I just don't like that much mess and that much lying. And so I felt like the romance was really based on her lying. I didn't really know what drew them together. Essentially all of what she told him was lies, and you can make an argument that like, well, he knew kind of that she was lying somewhat, and he's making allowances for it, and he knows how hard stuff is for her and whatever, but I'm just like, regardless, the entire relationship is built on lies. They also do some dumb shit as far as like their office romance stuff. Like, at one point they're like having sex like in the office. It's just a lot of dumb behavior in a way that I really just like can't forgive in a contemporary. And then also I realized, as someone who doesn't have an office job like that and cubicles and whatever, I hate office politics so much. And so many office romances have the external conflict be office politics, and I just can't. So for numerous reasons, this wasn't for me. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. I would probably read another book by this author, though. I think just like Ember as a main character just didn't work for me, and stuff about like just the context of this that I didn't realize going in didn't work for me. But I think someone was saying that like she has a future one coming out that's like a musician or something. I don't know. That could work. I'm not like saying this author was like a bad author. This just so wasn't for me, and I didn't know that until I read it. Then I read Foxglove by Adeline Grace. This is the sequel to Belladonna. This one was also 5 stars. This has a continuing mystery element, so all of the books in the series have some kind of mystery element, and it kind of makes sense how our main character gets pulled into that. We have continued stuff about death, sort of that death in the maiden idea. There's other characters that are sort of like entities that come in as well. In this case, it's Fate. He's kind of fucking up everything for everyone. So yeah, this one also loved. 5 out of 5 stars. I then read The Lady's Guide to Celestial Mechanics by Olivia Waite. This is a adult historical romance that is sapphic. And this follows a character whose father was a astronomer, and she primarily helped him out with that. And he was recognized as by like the Science Guild and all of that. And he passes away, and she is like, I still want to be recognized for being a scientist. And she doesn't have any connections to that like world. And she ends up being contacted by a woman that used to kind of work with them, whose husband was also a scientist, who her husband passed away, and so she's a widow, and she wants her to help translate this very famous French text. And so our main character like knows French and also knows all of these celestial mechanics to be able to do that. So she ends up inviting her to stay with her, and everything goes from there. This was so good. The historical elements and the like contending with queerness, especially sapphic relationships, was done so well as far as like, oh, different times, and you know, when some of the people like turn a blind eye to some of this stuff and when they don't, and women in science and how much they're pushed aside in science, and art. Like there's this whole component of the love interest also being like an artist and embroiderer, and that being a thing, and her not necessarily feeling like an artist. So you have all of those thematic elements outside of their relationship, and then their relationship itself is also really good. And they contend with like, there's a power differential both in age and in like one being having like wealth and stuff, and how do we contend with this in a time where like it's not like they can get married, nor do they want to get married. It's like a whole thing. It's so good. Yeah, so I loved this. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. This does have like smut in it, but it's not a smutty book. So I would say it has spice. There are numerous sex scenes, but they're a little bit more, not all of them are fade to black, but like more that. This came out in like 2020, so it wasn't quite when I feel like the heaviest of the smut was happening in romance. So yeah, I loved this. There's definitely future books in this series sort of potential as far as like companions and stuff of these like lady scientists back in this sort of period of time. Yeah, and I love this. From like, if you like historical, if you like, you know, historical sort of like feminism, science, all that, and having to contend with sort of that patriarchal stuff and sapphic relationships, this is fantastic. Again, 5 out of 5 stars. And then I read Wisteria, which was the final book in the Belladonna series. There is a novella coming out, but I think she's done overall in this series. This one is almost a companion to the other two, so it's technically a sequel. It's talked about as a sequel, but it's following different characters who were in the other books primarily. And this one is a like reincarnated lovers who don't know they're reincarnated romance. It's so good. Like, it's so good. I do love a reincarnated lovers kind of thing, and that's like the main thing. I will say that this one is a little bit weaker than the other two because there's a slight mystery element because it's not our like main character from the first two. That's not as prevalent. There's some things about the overarching series that don't quite get answered. That's a little bit frustrating. And yeah, but like the romance is really good. And yeah, the romance throughout these books is really good. So it's this like solid gothic fantasy, gothic historical fantasy mystery kind of thing with this romantic element. So I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. The overall series is like 5 out of 5 in my opinion. I love them. I listen to them on audio, highly recommend. And then finally, I read The Last Hero by Lyndon A. Lewis. This is the 3rd and final book in the First Sister series. I don't think it has another name. Yeah, the First Sister trilogy. And this is taking place in a future where there are Gaians who are like Earth and Mars, and Ikari who are Venus and Mercury? Must be, yes. And because we've like, you know, gone out into space and we are opposing each other, and then there's people that live in the belt who are called Asters, and there's all this like political turmoil going on between all of those people. So in the first book, we are following First Sister, who is part of this sort of like Handmaid's Tale-esque religion that the Gaians have. And then we also have another character who is part of the Ikari sort of like dualist military branch of things. And as the series goes on, we get more and more characters. So by this last book, there's like we follow some Asters, we follow some Gaians, we follow Still the First Sister, we follow all these people. So I can't go into a ton of detail, but this is kind of like if you combine sort of like a Red Rising, but better because it's women focused, with like an Expanse in a way, like politically, with maybe like one other thing, you kind of get this. So I really enjoyed this. This final book, I will say it's large, and there's so many threads that I feel like it was a little bit weaker than the rest of the books in the series. I think the first one is still my favorite. But this is covering so many different people in this like resistance, and trying to like, you know, redo the way that the world is and all this conflict and all of that. There were some things that felt like they were tied up a little bit too easily. I think this could have been a 4-book series. This final book, there's so many antagonists in this book, and this final book is taking like all of them out or dealing with them in some way, right? And it's too many. Like there's too many threads that got tied up in one book. So this is still like a 4-star, 3.75. But I would say the first couple of books are a little bit more solid, and I wish we just had slightly more time to wrap some things up because this was happening so rapid fire that it made some of these antagonists who are very strong seem a little bit more like incompetent, or like they were never really a threat to begin with when they definitely were. But yeah, this is very interesting, like the way that it talks about gender and politics and religion and all of that, like what it's contending with is very cool. Overall, I'd say this is a 4-star series. I still really enjoyed it, but didn't quite stick the landing for me. So that is it for all my fiction reads most recently. I'll try to keep up with this. It's so hard sometimes when you're so busy to be able to film like as you're reading all of these things. And I have a lot of other hobbies like my coloring and my video games. Anyway, excuses. Comment below, let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, or if you have any recommendations for me based on these books that I really enjoyed. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.